is Andy, son of Jim. I'm here to talk about The Last Kingdom, Seven Kings Must Die, the movie based on the TV series that concluded last year after 5 seasons. Now, transporting a TV series into a film is always a tough proposition. Over 5 seasons, The Last Kingdom usually had 10 hours to move the pieces of narrative and its characters into place in order to advance plot lines and the narrative each season, and indeed about 50 hours to tell the overall story of Uhtred of Bebbanburg, who was orphaned and enslaved by Vikings and eventually became his adopted family throughout the course of season 1 to the series conclusion in season 5, where Uhtred would finally reclaim his home in Bebbanburg. It was a fitting end to a TV series that in many ways managed to do what so many series often fail to do, and that it is finish its narrative on its own terms and tie up any loose ends that felt needed. When The Last Kingdom, Seven Kings Must Die was announced, my initial feeling was more excitement than apprehension, and on the surface, despite the symmetrical and almost full circle ending to the series, there was potentially so much more story that could be told. Not least because throughout the 5 seasons of The Last Kingdom, the show has managed to almost age Uhtred as much as a vampire. Throughout the show, we've had Alfred becoming a king, Alfred's entire reign, Alfred's successor Edward becoming king, and Edward's own sons and his bastard son, it's a great word to say, bastard son, and it actually be true, and they all growing up without Uhtred so much as showing a grey hair. It would almost be comical if the show didn't do the best thing it could do in that situation, and that was just to straight up ignore the problem. After all, the show's fun is to be had in The Last Kingdom's battleground of kings fighting, the Danes invading, and alliances rather than Uhtred dealing with old age. Uhtred is in many ways the most compelling thing about the show, but his problems and central character concerns stayed the same almost season to season, so his central being almost slotted into the central conflict of the show anytime in any season, which allowed us not to worry about his aging or indeed need to engage in it at all. And that is also despite the offspring of the royal lineage rapidly aging often season to season. Uhtred has always been a Northumbrian raised by Danes, forged in Saxon oats. Oats is in a vow, not oats on a field that means he wouldn't grow. Never mind. And he's normally torn between many different forces. He is a man at sea, and by far the most interesting and well developed aspect of the show, because despite the brilliant battle sequences and soapy game of chess over who will inherit which kingdom, Uhtred could remain stranded and his story would never feel resolved until he got his ancestral home, which happened in the final season of The Last Kingdom. So, when Seven Kingdoms Must Die started, I had already prepared for Uhtred unaged while Edward's grandkids would fight for the throne. That was my suspicion of what the plot would be anyway. And the film, for the first time, did start and does engage to an extent with Uhtred's age. He has grey hair, seems to have lost his urge for fighting, which makes sense as he's got his home back now, and his band of merry men also seem to have been affected by aging slightly now too. Finan struggles to stay awake on watch and things like that. And I'm not going to question the motivation for a movie like this beyond the fact that I guess there was more story to be told from the books. But I will say there are some real big presences missing from the TV show. Obviously Breda and Heston couldn't return, but Edward, Aelswit and Steora and Mildred, is it? They don't make an appearance. I think ultimately the decision to start with Edward's death is a good one in order to jump straight into the conflict. And one of the main elements most of us enjoy about these type of shows is, of course, the conflict between the different kingdoms and inheritors of the throne. Alexander Dreymon, if that is how you pronounce it, has always been a fantastic linchpin when it comes to the show, and he always played Uhtred with a level of vulnerability and emotion normally not seen to this extent with central warrior figures in any show. And his acting and his ability to sell emotions around the conflict and despair in many occasions does a better job than the series writing. On many occasions it's him that really gels everything together. David Dawson's Alfred was probably one of the other characters that felt three-dimensional, and while Breda, Ethelfled, Edward were all played decently, their characterization often felt a lot to be desired, and albeit perfectly serviceable. However, I felt the more down the family tree we got, the less characterization I felt. Not at the level of characterization of somebody like, say, Finan, whose entire personality is that he's Irish. But hey, that's enough for most people. It's enough for me. And to be fair, Mark Rowley does a great job with line delivery and it's funny. But by the time we get to Edward's grandkids, we are left with not very much. Ethelstan, these names are very familiar, are very... samey, but I've got my notes here. So Ethelstan felt somewhat fleshed out, at least in terms of his character journey by the end of season 5, which could probably leave this seemingly personality-like transplant we see him with by the start of Seven Kings Must Die a bit confusing. And much like Uhtred being the active geriatric being the most active geriatric in all the land, it kind of went, I guess maybe 10 or 15 years have passed, and I guess that's one way into why Ethelstan has changed so much as a character, because time has passed. And you know, exploring a closeted gay king being influenced by his half Dane Christian converted lover into atoning his sin by making all of England Christian. I mean, there's something really inherently Christian in that logic to me, which tracks in a way that shame and guilt can manifest in a way that I suppose could motivate somebody to change drastically and maybe act this way, which I do buy to an extent. So I didn't really have a problem with that, and it is an interesting idea. Now, the movie is framed around a prophecy that Finan's wife has had, which is Seven Kings Must Die, which is the title of the movie. It's almost distracting to an extent, as you're trying to figure out who are the Seven Kings, and indeed, is Uhtred one of those kings? It almost frames the movie in a similar way that the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford does. And although while that movie has a significant event in the title, it opens up the movie to explore the myths of legend, destiny and celebrity of the time. But in Seven Kings Must Die, it's almost a needless distraction or something that almost leads to characters behaving in a way that might be enacted in something like Macbeth, maybe. Ultimately, it's a much lesser problem than the pacing. However, the first half of the movie, I have to say, I really enjoyed. It's brutal, it's fast paced, there was a sense of doom and finality and uneasiness that often didn't exist in the TV series, at least in relation to Uhtred anyway. No matter how much stakes and dramatic conflict escalated, you always knew that Uhtred had the safety of a few more episodes or a few more seasons in him if you binge watch this. In this movie, you really do worry for him and fear for him and can start to stress for him, especially when there is a prophecy that appears to be coming true. And I think that's when this movie is at its best, and that is where it's something that the TV series doesn't have, other than maybe the final season, if you knew there wasn't going to be a movie. It's a sense that anything could happen and there could be a sense of finality, and Uhtred mightn't get out of this one. It's something that I obviously didn't feel very much throughout the series, but I felt it in this movie. But I think the second half of this movie especially is where it absolutely falls apart in relation to the pace and narrative. The TV show had a problem with pacing from time to time too. Athelflaed falling in love with Eric after an episode of being kidnapped seemed rushed. The best that TV has to offer, like The Wire, Treme or Sopranos, seem to convey the passage of time and events expertly through the time and minutes spent with a character that indicate key changes and realizations and the passage of time in a much more natural way. In The Last Kingdom, I often had to almost justify the pacing by reminding myself, okay, even though this scene time has only been 1 hour in TV show time, I guess it's months and months in the world time. It's a difficult balancing act, and much like Breeda's story arc in season 5, I felt it needed more time to breathe. But at least in watch time, the TV series, when I had pacing issues, it was at least an hour or two. In this, it suffers from that problem on steroids and also robs us of some of my favourite moments in The Last Kingdom, the quiet moments in between the chaos and character reflection. There is no time for that at all. I'm going to get into a little bit of spoilers now to illustrate my point. In the movie, there is a moment where Finan's wife is dead. He finds out, mourns for like half a beat, and then is cracking jokes 5 minutes later. Now, if this were a TV show, it would have had time to breathe, at least for an episode. If events on screen don't have time to deal with consequences and ramifications and don't appear to matter to the characters of the world, it won't matter to us, the audience. The same thing happens with Aelfward is murdered by his brother Ethelstan, or when Eldham is killed for being a traitor. This is when the movie really gathers momentum, but we get, so little time in between Athelstan seeing the error of his ways, Uhtred forgiving him, the geography timeline of Uhtred being banished, to Uhtred being in Shetland, to Uhtred returning to Wessex, to his friends meeting him there. This is just where it starts to completely unravel and run out of the rails of things, and it kills its momentum. This needed to be a mini-series, really. It really did. Season 5 suffered from this, as I mentioned, in a smaller scale. But I knew when I paused the movie for a toilet break, and there was only 40 minutes left at this point, I knew the movie was in trouble. The final battle itself, although nicely choreographed, didn't feel epic enough, and it just kind of fizzled out. I liked the setup and conception of the battle. It set things up nicely for the stage, but yeah, just much like the movie, after the first half, there's a complete swerve, and the prophecy kind of fizzled out in a different way as well. And yeah, I just would like to have seen a few more episodes and battles of this. Initially, during the final battle as well, Uhtred gets stabbed by a sword out of nowhere and seems like he meets his end, which is, in a weird way, would have justified the movie fizzling out and would have been a bit poetic, as Uhtred's journey in time on this earth had ended. So it at least would have made some sense if much like the anticlimactic end of the movie, it just kind of ended because Uhtred's warrior time on earth had ended. And instead we get Uhtred surviving that, surrounded by his loved ones and family, which at a certain point, and he gets stabbed a lot in this battle, so it's quite a jump even to the dinner hall scene. But we get Uhtred hearing the halls of Valhalla and then seeing his lost friends and family behind him. And the film ends with Uhtred almost in limbo as to what he's exactly going to do next. Torn between the two worlds, wondering where to go, to Valhalla or remain on Earth. And despite the movie bumbling the plot and story and momentum of the first half of the film, it's the final scene that completely fits the character and main themes of the show as a whole, as a man torn between two different lands and two different cultures. So I kind of applauded for that. But overall, my good film hunting verdict for this is hit and miss.